Good afternoon and Happy New Year to everybody. Welcome back. Hope you both had a terrific holiday. I'm Eric Blank, and this is a Commissioner's Information Meeting on January 7th on Income Qualified Bill Assistance and Energy Programs 2025 Objectives and Work Plan. Commissioner Plant, any thoughts before we
No, ready to get going. Happy New Year to everybody. Good to see you guys.
likewise, Commissioner Goman?
Yes, Happy New Year. Good to see y'all. And no, looking forward to getting started. Thanks.
All right, with that, Ms. Crandall, you want to turn on your camera and again, thanks so much for your leadership and work and everything else. So, Ms. Crandall, take us away.
Well, thank you, commissioners. Just to get us started, I wanted to introduce some of the commission staff who are on the line. This is a little bit of a different meeting from some CIMs because we will only have PUC staff participating and trying to answer your questions. So I am Kelly Crandall. I am one of the advisors to the commissioners. I'm joined by Tricia Anstey, who is our affordability project manager, who's been running the utility bill help program. And then also Tamar Moss, who is a fellow with our research and emerging issues team, who's been working on data and analysis. We also have Erin McLaughlin from Commission Council on the line if additional support is needed. And so again, we will have a lot to talk through today. We are not program implementers ourselves, so there may be some places where we'll do better in answering your questions than others, and we can always run things down as needed. Some of the objectives for the meeting today, we will be talking a little bit initially about some of the more recent work on income qualified energy initiatives. But the majority of the focus will be on you all's discussion. We'd like to hear from you about the commissioner's goals for 2025 work related to income qualified bill assistance programs and energy programs. Talk a little bit more specifically about objectives and priorities around programmatic improvements. And then at a high level, we'll talk about some possible procedural options that could follow from this discussion. So this isn't a decision meeting. We will be taking what we hear here and bringing them back to you in different ways through upcoming weekly meetings where you would be making decisions. So just for the benefit of the listening audience, kind of explaining what you'll see here and what we'll talk about will be some straw proposals, but when it comes to additional actions, it may look different based on what we hear in the discussion with you all today. The overall agenda, I'll start us off by talking about some key terminology and just basic background to get us going. The meat of the discussion will be on 3 discussion topics, as I noted, and I think we'll probably spend a lot of time on this 2025 goals. The meeting was listed until 4 o'clock. I'm not sure we're going to go that long, but happy to have as much detailed conversation as you all would like here. There are 3 terms that we'll use pretty consistently throughout this meeting: income qualified, disproportionately impacted, and energy burdened. The first 2 are more statutory directives. The third one is more of a common practice generally that has been embedded in various rules and cases. With income qualified, what we're generally talking about is a statute that says that the commission can grant specific programs, rates, and so forth to customers who have certain levels of household income, which is at 200% federal poverty level, 80% area median income, and 60% state median income. We'll talk a little bit more about what those translate to in dollars later in the session, but that's kind of a general PUC term. In practice, each program that we'll talk about today may have their own terminology that they use in terms of what is actually a eligibility or qualification for income. But in general, when I say income qualified, those are the levels that we're talking about. Disproportionately impacted is another statutory term that we have. This has been was initially put forward for the commission through Senate Bill 21-272. It's since been updated by some other legislation, and it creates a term for agencies across the state, which refers to, for example, certain census block groups with high proportions of households that are low income, people of color, housing cost burdened, or linguistically isolated. There are a number of different criteria for this. I'm not going to go through each one unless you all have some questions about that. But this is another specific statutory term that the commission will be taking through an upcoming rulemaking and making adjustments to as needed for the course of cases. And then finally, energy burdened. Generally, a household is going to be considered energy burdened if more than 6% of its gross household income is spent on across energy. And so if, you know, we have certain programs in which a 6% energy burden is baked in certain ways as a factor in customer enrollment and eligibility. And so when you have an extremely high energy burden, it can result in energy poverty, higher risk of disconnection, things like that. But energy burden can be very household specific. And it's been used in a couple of different more widely known studies, including an ACEEE report from 2016, which I think is probably going to be one of the best known resources with it, and then a report that the Colorado Energy Office issued a couple of years ago, which has also been kind of a foundation for some of this work. There are two types of programs that this discussion will mainly focus on. The first is income qualified bill assistance, which is going to be more dollar to dollar direct reduction in what a customer might pay in their bill or reduction in their arrears. So it's funding for either reducing past debts or reducing bills going forward. Then there's income qualified energy programs. And so that's going to be more like weatherization or rebates for different kinds of activities that are specifically available to customers who have certain income levels. And those may combine to decrease a bill, to increase a bill, to stabilize a bill. It depends on the packaging of the programs. But the commission has increasingly seen set-asides for budgets for different types of programs that are dedicated to customers based on income. A big focus of the discussion today will be on the percentage of income payment plan program, which is often known as an electric or gas affordability program. This is established by Electric Rule 3412, Gas Rule 4412, and it's been evolving over a decade through rulemakings, advice letters, and a lot of collaborative work, both in cases and outside of cases. When a customer income qualifies to participate in the program, they can receive one or both benefits, being a fixed monthly credit that is based on their energy burden that would discount their bills. So they might receive a monthly bill credit, or they might receive arrearage forgiveness. So say they have a certain amount past due bills that might be either reduced over time or written off entirely, depending on the amount. And so the customer may qualify for one or both of those benefits. This is a ratepayer funded program. Residential customers pay up to $1 a month, depending on the utility, as part of their regular bills, and that goes into funding this program. There are sometimes contributions from the utilities themselves, but it depends on the utility, and it's more on the ratepayer funded side. And there are contributions from other customer classes. It's easiest to cite the $1 a month for residential customers because that's fairly flat. The PIP funding stream is just one of multiple funding streams, including a separate energy assistance system benefit charge, which is collected by the utilities as well and has sort of similar purposes in terms of being dedicated for assistance and weatherization, but is a different funding stream. The PIP program can currently be accessed in 4 ways, and this has been a lot of collaborative work, starting with some statutory changes and some rules changes, but more recently, over the last year or two, work by different assistance providers and utilities to try to create more of these flows. The most common way that a customer becomes enrolled in a PIP program at a utility is by applying for the Low Income Energy Assistance Program at the state, which is run by Department of Human Services. This uses a 60% state median income and provides a benefit for home heating costs that can vary in amount. And I won't go into too much detail on those because we've had prior CIMs, but please do ask if you have questions throughout. The newer opportunities to enroll in PIP come through bill assistance through Energy Outreach Colorado, which will pay up to $1,000 to customers who are actively in arrears and potentially at risk of disconnection. The Weatherization Assistance Program implemented by the Colorado Energy Office, which if a customer gets into the LEAP program, they can then be eligible for weatherization assistance, and that can provide another opportunity to enroll in this. And then there's the Utility Bill Help Program, which has been moved from a pilot into more of a regular activity at the PUC. It uses eligibility for other Department of Human Services programs to help refer people to the utilities if they have not yet been able to get into one of these other programs, or if they have been deemed ineligible for a program like LEAP, but may otherwise be income eligible. And before turning over to more of the first discussion, just as staff, we kind of wanted to raise why we think this is a really important dialogue to be having right now. We've seen in the last few years a couple of different emergencies, including the COVID-19 pandemic, the winter heating season a couple years ago, where we've seen either higher participation in need-based programs or greater amounts of assistance needed for existing customers. So we've seen some strain in the budgets that are available for these kinds of programs. We are also seeing a greater number of legislative directives that create new applications and new sources of funding for customer programs that's resulting in the need to kind of think about how to braid together all of these programs a little bit differently. And it's making things a lot more complex. We're seeing a lot of cases come in silos and with different revenue sources. And so it puts a lot on service providers to have to figure out the ways to braid that all together as they're working with people who might be eligible. And then finally, part of this is, I think, significant because in the last year, we've had the first complete year of the Utility Bill Help Program. We also had a third-party evaluation of PIP programs, and both of those have really suggested some important opportunities we could take to continue the process of program improvement and keep doing it in a collaborative way. So moving into the first topic of discussion, we wanted to talk a little bit about your goals for work in 2025. And so we've put forward some straw ideas that we'll talk a little bit about, but we really want to just hear from you all the pros and cons of different goals, things that you would change, how you would guide our work on this issue for 2025. And we think this would really help with us with prioritizing different activities, evaluating and comparing options. For example, if we have a couple different ways to achieve a particular outcome, we could look at it as compared to the goals you all talk about today. They're not intended to be binding. It would be more the kind of thing where, for example, based on the discussion, it could show up in a future miscellaneous proceeding or something like that as part of the guidance for staff to move forward. So I'm just going to summarize this at a high level, what we put forward. I'm more than happy to answer questions on sort of why we put forward the ones that we did for discussion here as you all dig into it a little bit more. But we selected 5 straw goals to start with for income qualified initiatives in 2025. One is that we could look at maximizing the participation of potentially eligible customers in assistance programs. Another is we could do more work to better identify characteristics of vulnerability and try to target programs to customers that, for example, are extremely low income or have other factors that might lead to the need for additional assistance. We could focus on customer experience and make it as easy as possible for customers to get and stay enrolled in these assistance programs. We could work on increasing the transparency of the programs to do more real-time program evaluation, troubleshooting, checking performance, that sort of thing. and we could look at efficiency. And so that would be looking at, for example, ways to leverage income qualified energy programs to reduce the amount of funds that are needed for bill assistance, because we're helping customers transition from near-term funding need to more long-term bill stability. So again, those are straw proposals. I am more than happy to answer questions on them as you get into the discussion. And Mr. Chair, would you like to start here?
Yeah, that'd be great. Can you hear me, Ms. Crandall?
Yes.
Well, first, I just want to thank you, Ms. Crandall, and your team for your leadership driving these issues forward and framing them up for our consideration. And sort of in the spirit you suggested of brainstorming and putting forth a straw proposal, I just want to briefly put forward some thoughts that I've tried to introduce in an ad hoc way and in various cases, but wanted to see if I could, at least for purposes of discussion, put them forward in a more comprehensive way. If you could go to the next slide. So I've on this slide, there it is. I tried to summarize the total spending on income qualified and clean energy programs. I think in 23, it was roughly 150 million. It doesn't include the clean heat programs, and I think there's been significant growth in the spending since then. And basically 2/3 is on the clean energy programs, and 1/3 is on the direct bill assistance. And for better or worse, I just say the clean energy programs have conflicting incentives where we're trying to drive participation and cost effectiveness. At the same time, we're trying to provide support to these communities. The second thing I'd point out is that it seems like these programs have multiple providers. Just in this world, it's community solar garden developers, utilities, the Colorado Energy Office, the EOC, and the Department of Human Services. And it also feels like this gets in front of us in sort of individual cases without the whole thing before us and in the record. The last thing, and I'd say my biggest concern with this, is that these programs and dollars are allocated on an opt-in basis. And as such, I'm concerned that we may be systematically targeting support to those customers who may be least at risk, as opting in may often be challenging and time consuming. So I'm just wondering if there's more we could do. If you can go to the next slide, and there's only 5 slides, so it'll be quick. This is from the public service company TEP. Basically, public service company has 1.5 to 1.6 million customers in Colorado. 400,000 are income qualified, over 400,000 or more than a quarter are income qualified. 320,000 more public service companies suggest are in disproportionately impacted communities. So almost half the residential customers are eligible, equity eligible as the company defined it. And again, I just wonder if that's too big a group given the resources we have available. If you can go to the next slide. In contrast, this slide shows public service companies' residential disconnections over the last 5 years. The total bars are total disconnects. The blue is reconnects, and the orange is net remaining disconnects. And the data is not totally clear, but it looks like we may be permanently disconnecting thousands of customers every year. There's some evidence that somewhere between 10 and 15% of unhoused individuals who sought assistance reported inability to pay utilities as a cause of their homelessness. And so my takeaway from this is there may be a more manageable group of 1,000, maybe 10,000, maybe 20,000 customers that appear most at risk based on disconnect and arrearage data. So if you can go to the next slide. And I'd just say, in summary, current income qualified efforts in Colorado may benefit the customers who may be least at risk, given the opt-in requirements. Focus dollars and support on those customers that are easiest to acquire and most likely to participate. And it seems like little dollars and focus may be targeted to the customers who may be most at risk, given language barriers, tenant situations, disabilities, or other reasons, and have high barriers to participation and are difficult to reach out to and expensive to sign up. You can go to the next slide. So one idea that I've been trying to put forward in individual cases is to manage cash flow. Most large utilities, including Xcel Energy, have propensity to pay models that identify at-risk customers many months before disconnect notices are sent based on linking confidential bill arrearage, payment history, assistance requests, call and usage data with more public available data on income, education, family size, race, location, gender, and other household data. So I guess the idea is to explore using these propensity to pay models and other data to identify a subgroup of potentially eligible customers that are at the highest risk of disconnect and proactively target assistance toward them. Once a disconnect notice is sent, it may often be too late to help them. And as I understand it, they have to voluntarily opt in to avoid getting disconnected or to delay the disconnect. So last slide. And I just throw these 6 ideas at you in terms of an addition to and maybe a modification to Ms. Crandall's list of 2025 goals. I'm wondering if we should shift away from trying to maximize program participation among a prohibitively large group of customers through opt-in approaches and start shifting more towards proactively supporting customers most at risk of permanent disconnection. A second 2025 goal would be to understand propensity to pay models of the utilities and how customers are targeted for disconnect. A third goal would be to proactively target support to customers most at risk of permanent disconnect, really independently of their ability to request help. A fourth goal would be to follow up on the service requests of customers who have been disconnected to better understand their experience and outcome. In the last public service company gas rate case, we asked the company to conduct a survey. I think that survey got delayed, but it eventually did happen, although we haven't seen the results. Fifth, I'm wondering if we should ask for an update on spending, customer groups, and disconnect numbers so we can see the comprehensive picture in front of us, like that slide one I tried to pull together, but it's probably dated and maybe inaccurate in certain ways. And also explores ways we can maybe better coordinate efforts and in a more comprehensive manner, so we have all the data in front of us as we face these decisions in individual cases. And the last thing I'd add to this list is maybe find a way to better represent customers targeted for permanent disconnect before the PUC. I know there's intervenor funding models in Oregon and elsewhere that may be useful approaches we could adopt here. So I'll stop there again with thanks to Ms. Crandall for helping me get this in front of you guys, and I'll stop there and turn it over to you, Commissioner Plant, and welcome to react to this or anything else you'd like to say. Commissioner Plant?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate that. And I think, you've identified some really critical components in a number of those that I had identified as well. So it's interesting to see the suggestions that you put forward, and I think we should pursue those avenues. One of the things that, I sort of stuck out to me, as you pointed out, the need for prioritization of those who are most at need. And streamlining the process for getting people involved in the programs. And I don't know, this may dovetail a little bit with some of the stuff that you were suggesting, but one of the things I was thinking about in terms of that proactive effort would be to be engaging more through the health or the human services agencies, the county human services departments, the local nonprofits, really trying to take a more localized approach to outreach, because I think a lot of the people who are falling into the most at-risk categories are probably people that have engaged in one way or another with various different other support programs at the local level and may be known to the community. And so I feel like we may be losing opportunities for engagement that way. So there may be some opportunities, there to sort of engage people at that local level. Particularly as you've identified, language barriers and other barriers that might exist. And I'm not sure, I think, we've probably all sort of seen the hodgepodge nature of these various different programs as they're developed from utilities, different ways of calculating enrollment, different ways of engaging people in the programs, different ways of calculating what benefits are. And it's really, it seems to me that one of the things that we could have staff focus on is trying to get, a real lay of the land of where all of these various different entities are and how we might be able to funnel them so that we're facilitating, the most effective way to get services out to people. The other thing that I was thinking about, and this again ties into some of what you were talking about, is, in terms of like an objective, it seems like getting people who are eligible for PIP into PIP should be one objective, and then enabling them to be not eligible for PIP again should be the next objective. So really targeting, energy efficiency services towards people who are getting those kinds of that kind of assistance. But then also, I mean, PIP is based on, if you're talking about enrollment as a function of, the percentage of your energy burden versus your income, you're looking at both your energy cost size and your income size. So really making sure that they're tied in with workforce programs within the state as well. And some might look at that as being sort of outside of the purview of the PUC. But as we look at these things being the eligibility criteria, I think we need to look at both the income side and the energy cost side as they work together to establish that energy burden. And so really analyzing ways in which we can effectively get people who are energy burdened and who are most at risk into the program, and then how we prepare for them to be able to not be eligible for the program again as another criteria. The weatherization program, when I was at the energy office, we ran the weatherization program, and I'd note two things. One, the federal requirements around the program are very stringent, and as I recall, we had to spend a minimum of $6,500 per house. There were other funding sources that might get added on top to add additional measures, but the opportunity to really pare down and offer a limited set of measures to a much larger population of people so that you could get those services out and start to get people, those, maybe three critical things that every single house is going to need. If you could, do that, you couldn't do that through the WET program because it had a minimum required, level of service delivery for anybody who received weatherization services. And so that's the kind of thing that I think we might be able to tie in with the cash assistance to try and then drive down people's energy bills. I mean, for focusing on lighting, duct sealing, weather sealing, as a couple of really high benefit payback measures that we could get delivered out to those people, but through that separate funding, not through the weatherization funding that has all the requirements and limitations on it. The other thing that I was thinking of as I was looking at the numbers in your slides, Mr. Chairman, is I think about half of that money was coming through federal appropriations, which are, much of which was heavily plussed up during the COVID bills and the Inflation Reduction Act. And I think we can expect to see that those numbers are going to go down significantly in the coming years. I mean, that's what we saw during ARA. I think we had an increase of a similar amount with that they have today. I think the number was somewhere around $3 billion nationwide went into the weatherization program, and then that got dropped down to maybe a couple $100 million right after ARA expired. And I think we can probably see that same kind of a reduction coming with the new administration. And so I think we're going to really see, not more of an emphasis on the need for getting these programs deployed with fewer resources. And I think that the utility component is going to end up becoming a much larger percentage of the overall programmatic funding than maybe exists today. So those are just, one other thought that I just wanted to throw out there. And I don't know if you guys both have some thoughts about this, but I'd love to hear us kind of think about what would performance metrics be around this? How would we measure success? How can we gauge success as it relates to these programs? And what kind of things should we sort of be preparing ourselves for measurement in order to determine whether or not we're succeeding?
Well, appreciate it. And I think strongly support most of what you said, Commissioner Plant. So Commissioner Goman, you have 5 goals from Ms. Crandall, 6 goals from me, a few more from Commissioner Plant. Anywhere you'd like to go, Commissioner Goman.
Yeah, I unfortunately don't have most of them in front of me in writing, but I
know.
Getting to Commissioner Plant's kind of last point, especially about it seems as though the largest bucket of funding, whether through programs like efficiency and transportation, electrification, things like that, or PIP, are coming from each individual utility and are kind of a confined pool within that utility to dole out within that utility. And then you have kind of a bucket through LEAP and kind of CEO that are generally federal funds. And I think I would generally agree with Commissioner Plant's thought that those are probably going to decrease, if anything, in the future. That federal pot going forward, whether through LEAP or through, a lot of the avenues the IRA money is coming in, like through CEO. So that leaves you very dependent upon kind of support within the utility, whether that's through, clean energy programs or whatever it might be, or through PIP itself, which I don't want to get into a rabbit hole on this, which I'm sure we could very quickly. But, this is a much larger problem than just utilities, certainly not confined within each utility. And so I think I would really suggest that we stay engaged and really push for additional discussions and stakeholder groups on the statewide level to address kind of the larger equity issues at play here. That yes, we have a role in helping to try to solve and in helping to equalize to the best of our abilities. But I think it's important, especially given some of the dynamics at the federal level that Commissioner Plant pointed out, the extent to which we'll become even more reliant upon the silos of each utility to solve its own kind of income challenges within the utility looks very, very difficult for some of our utilities. Some of our utilities in particular have very high levels of need and, you know, lower customer bases or the rest of the customer base potentially only marginally above the level of need. And so it becomes very difficult to think of how we, in a much more meaningful way, you know, in progressing this issue, can really solve this issue in a really satisfying way within the silos of each individual utility having to personally fund this and dole it out. There are, you know, we do face this issue significantly with Black Hills Electric, whether it's the size of efficiency and transportation electrification plans or customer assistance, which they still have a waiting list for. You know, to what extent do we address this need with surcharges to other customers to deal with it? And in many cases, I think we see that as being really difficult in the way it's set up. So I guess the first one, and not to like sidetrack us too much, but I think we really need to stay engaged and push for more of those conversations to continue to be at the state level to address this, I think, as a statewide problem, rather as just in these silos of utilities where at some point we cannot continue to raise the surcharges on an increasingly small number of customers to solve, you know, high needs in specific utilities. And that's just a reality of the situation, I think, that we're faced with. To kind of the point in the question on should maximizing participation be a goal? You know, certainly from a fairness standpoint, it makes sense to me that if someone is eligible, they should be encouraged and able to seek the assistance to which they are fairly eligible. But I don't think we actually know what that looks like from an economic standpoint. I think, Chairman, you laid out some of the real tough realities of the percentage of customers that it appears either are eligible or need this help. And so, especially as we look at some of the more challenging utility territories, you know, what does that look like? If we actually saw 100% participation of people who are eligible, what would that look like in terms of surcharges to the rest of the customers? And so I think, you know, that might be part of what we're looking at this year, or could look at this year, is what is the depth of the need and what does it take financially to actually solve that? And is it even feasible to go about the approach of saying, let's maximize participation? You know, are those outrageous surcharges at some point that really would not be acceptable or sustainable in order to get to a goal of maximized participation? Is something I certainly like from an idealistic standpoint, but economically, I don't think we have the data to say what that would look like or if that really is a feasible route to go down. I think your assumption is the need is much greater than the available funding. We have the ability to increase the available funding, but certainly that is not an infinite ability. At some point, it's not realistic. And I think understanding
or costless.
Yeah, and so like understanding where that is, and I think that's something that could be a goal for this year, is really to understand that better. How much would it cost to increase participation by X amount? You know, I don't think we 100% understand that at this point. I think it would be helpful to understand the propensity to pay models better. I think I'm not sure we've really seen this. I know it's a issue you have brought up several times. We don't have one in front of us. I think it's a hypothesis about what's in this, what it would tell us, and how many of our utilities are using that. So I can't say for certain that that is something we could or should use, because I've never even seen one and don't have confirmation that every utility is even doing this. But I think potentially a goal for this year is let's answer those questions. Is this out there? What does it show? How is it being used? How could it be used in a different way, if we wanted to try to target a system?
And can I just jump in for a second?
Yeah.
Independent of whether I've characterized what they've used correctly, they're using something to figure out who's getting disconnected. And I think they do forecast that for cash flow purposes. So maybe it needs to be said more broadly. So I just wouldn't want to lock into the propensity to pay model. It's just, how are these utilities deciding who gets permanently disconnected, and when do they know, and is there a way we can get earlier notice? So sorry for interrupting.
No, and I agree with that
Commissioner.
probably more than what I saw on the screen. The idea that we're at an earlier stage than the bullet I saw on the screen represented. I don't think we know that these definitively exist or 100% what's involved in them or what they're being used for. So I think we're at an earlier stage of discovery here in what is out there, what is being used, how are utilities kind of prioritizing making these decisions to understand what information is even at our disposal to understand the most at-risk customers. Commissioner Flynn.
Yeah, I was just going to throw in one of the things that, as I was looking into this, a number of states, I think Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, New York, have all done, is to use the full faith and credit of the state as a backing tool behind financial assistance programs for low income to avoid the disconnections or to defer disconnections. And I don't know to what extent we might be able to do that here in Colorado. Obviously, that would take legislation, but if we were able to put the full faith and credit of the state behind it, that may actually reduce the number of disconnections and the time frames, lengthen the time frames between when somebody gets, is identified as at risk and gets disconnected.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to bring up, I think we could probably stand to have a significant more amount of information this year with regard to what does the most vulnerable customer group look like to our understanding. I think, Chairman, you kind of expressed this concern that in all likelihood, the more sophisticated that qualify for the assistance are likely getting it. I think that is probably likely. One of my biggest concerns here is that signing up for a lot of these programs is confusing, labor intensive. You have to understand what's available, what's going on. There could be language barriers, educational barriers, a whole bunch of things that really stop people from seeking this assistance. But I think it's also important to understand there could be other more structural barriers. If we have shared metering, how does, if we assume there is a certain percentage, of the lower income population living in multifamily housing, may not have individual gas meters. In many cases, they do not. And so how do you understand who's behind the meter that's being served there? Those customers aren't showing up as customers. It's XYZ apartment building. And so how do you link and understand who's there? And so in that case, the default might look like that person's not paying their full rent or HOA bill or, or whatever it is. And so I think it gets confusing as you look at the details of, to your point, these might be the most sophisticated customers. These might also be customers who may necessarily not always be the most vulnerable because their bills are in their own name and they may well own the property to be able to make improvements, say, through our different programs like res programs and things like that. And so I have a lot of questions around kind of multi-tenant housing, especially where we have shared metering, bills in landlords' names. You know, there are all sorts of people who may very well not be able to afford their bills, but are kind of slipping under our radar because for whatever reason, they do not get an individual bill in their name and it never attaches to kind of their demographic or income situation, whereas they probably should be, you know, entitled to certain relief. So that's something I think we could really stand to learn quite a bit more. I think it goes under your general heading of kind of understanding who are the most vulnerable customers and how do we identify them, but it's very, very complicated when those folks may not have a utility bill in their name. And what do you do about that? It doesn't mean they might not get evicted as a result of this situation. It's just how do we possibly identify them? And I don't know the degree to which, let's say you have a multifamily housing building with individually metered electric and shared meter gas, which is very common. Does the utility understand who's behind the gas meter? You know, are those things attached to each other or are they not? So I think there's just a lot we could learn there to better understand, because I think we're getting to the idea that, yeah, we need to target relief to those who are the most vulnerable. I think we're understanding the financial situation here is very large if we were to keep a giant pool, but the things we don't understand about who needs the help is a significant list. And I think multifamily housing and shared metering is a really major part of our lack of understanding there. Mr. Plant?
Yeah,
So
I think that's a really important
Well,
point.
go ahead.
I'm sorry, I just had one question for you around that point. You know, one of the things that I feel like we have as a state, we have, you know, a human services department that identifies people on an individual basis for a variety of different services that are coming through that program. Would it be, would that be a more effective funnel? As opposed to coming back up through the meter to identify who is eligible, coming down from people who are already on various different, you know, support programs that are income qualified and eligible through those programs. Just in having energy be one of those programs that also goes to support people who are income eligible through human services.
Commissioner Gomez.
Yeah. No, I mean, I generally agree with you. Like, as to my first point of like, this problem is far bigger than just what you see come in a utility bill. Like, there are so many housing situations, and they especially get more complicated in different situations with multifamily housing or rental situations that just can lead to all sorts of reasons people are not identified and able to get the help they need, and they may well be at the highest risk of disconnection or eviction, as it may be. It's just we don't see it because their name is not appearing on some bill. The only other thing I wanted to point out with regard to customer experience, Ms. Crandall had kind of a make it as easy as possible for customers to get the help they're entitled to. You know, I agree with that. I think it feels like a very intimidating web of help with a lot of very well-intentioned programs and individuals, but when you put it all together, it's confusing and difficult for customers. I would probably err slightly more toward that. I was a little weary of your point on your slide, Chairman, on getting the help to customers who do not even ask. I don't know how that technically works. You know, if they're not asking, we just credit something on their bill and don't even tell them why or how they got there. So like, I would just be a little worried toward that wording and more probably err toward Ms. Crandall's on making the barriers lower, connecting the dots through SNAP and other county resources and kind of how these things all come together to make it much easier for people who are eligible to understand the process and get the help they need. I'm not so certain someone who doesn't apply for anything can get help through one of these programs. You know, that to me feels like a really challenging idea.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I was thinking you just automatically provide assistance. I'm just wondering if we should delay disconnection. You know, if your internet shut down, sending an email and then disconnecting somebody 60 days later may not be the best disconnect policy. So it's more focused on disconnection policy than maybe assistance.
Okay.
But it sounds like we have, maybe I presented some of my thinking too narrowly, but it sounds like we have general support among us to focus more on the most disadvantaged customers, whether that's defined through propensity to pay, through coordinating with other state and local agencies, or getting underneath multifamily housing. It sounds like the three of us support the general concept of trying to do more to, and you know, maybe it's really through disconnect policy, and rethinking hard who we permanently disconnect, as a way of helping target those most at risk of permanent disconnect. So I don't know if you guys have anything further to say, or if and I guess I strongly agree with bringing this back to a CWM or a future SIM to keep this conversation going. You know, once we see sort of maybe a rewrite of the 2025 goals based on this conversation, maybe and you know, once you see my presentation and once we all have an opportunity to reflect on each other's comments, you know, maybe we could bring this back in the coming weeks. So, Commissioner Plant, thoughts, comments?
Yeah, no, I like that idea. And I think also getting some of the other entities in front of us that are delivering services, you know, whether it's human services or CEO or, I mean, you know, I just, one of the things that I keep coming back to, you know, when CEO, I mean, I haven't talked to them about this, so I don't know this firsthand, but at least from the time when I was doing it and we got the ARA money and we had this huge increase in the amount of resources going into weatherization, we needed to build up our community, you know, the service agencies that were delivering all of these services so that they could meet the kind of capacity that we now had all this money to, you know, deliver. And what happens on the back end of that money getting cut off is you have this, you know, this ability to serve without any resources behind it, you know, and then that just sort of falls away. And, you know, if in fact we have built up a capacity around the state to deliver a higher degree of weatherization services that's, you know, sort of commensurate with the higher budgets, it seems like as those budgets get smaller, there might be an opportunity to work through the weatherization program and their local service agencies to start delivering some basic weatherization services to people who qualify for cash assistance. You know, it's the whole, you know, putting a plug in the tub before you're trying to fill it up. You know, it's kind of the no-brainer thing to do. And I feel like if we miss the opportunity, you know, who knows when that comes back again in terms of having all of this excess capacity as the budgets get reduced.
Well, I especially like that idea, combining it with, you know, maybe instead of trying to do something comprehensive, we really try and focus on the, you know, one or two or three, you know, blower doors, whatever they are, most cost-effective things. So if it's, you know, if we're outside the federal guidelines because it's largely utility funded, maybe that's an opportunity to really focus on a broader, more highly cost-effective way, which I think was maybe your first or second comment originally. So Commissioner Gilman, any further thoughts before we turn it back to Ms. Crandall to go to the next section?
Yeah, one other thought is something we also might be able to work on this year is perhaps improving how we calculate and think of bill impacts of different kind of increased expenditures or programs. So to the extent to which, or CPCNs, or whatever it is, whatever thing we're looking at, to the extent whatever it is we're looking at is going to add $500 million, $1 billion, $2 billion to customers' bills, it seems to me that necessarily results in some increased number of customers now being more vulnerable or more at risk on the lowest end. And then if you presume you are serving those customers with bill assistance programs, largely through the utility, that would increase the budget for those programs because we have more customers. So in essence, there is a bit of a duplicative bill impact here, whereas customers are paying for whatever it is, the program, the CPCN, the ERP, the whatever. But then also, since there is an increased number of customers now at risk because bills will go up, we need to also probably have a way to understand the likely bill impact of increased assistance as well as part of those bill impacts for the discrete decisions. Just to say, like, this is a bit circular and that makes it difficult, but perhaps we can think through this more and get a little better at how we analyze bill impacts, knowing that each bill impact to the positive likely has the result of more vulnerable customers requiring assistance.
No, I really like that. I think it also, follows up on Commissioner Plant's idea of putting in place performance metrics and, trying to, get the data. And I feel like on an ad hoc basis, we've been asking for that in individual cases. But if we had, a common set of analysis that was applied in, each situation, whether it's the utility cost test, the ratepayer impact test, the TRC, every case, it seems like we're making this up, on the fly. But, if we had a common set of metrics and approaches to, quantify non-participant rate impacts, I think that would be really useful. And, I think Ms. Crandall's going to suggest we open up an M docket. So maybe in the context of that M docket, one of the pieces we can take on is, a more general approach to figuring out non-participant rate and bill impacts, performance metrics, and just getting a common set of comprehensive data so we're not like just seeing one piece of the elephant in any individual case. But Commissioner Gilman, I don't know if I've accurately characterized your comment or
Yeah, no, I was just gonna add one more.
Different.
I was just gonna add one more thing.
One more
I'm
thing.
trying to fill in a bit of a big picture overview phase, I think, here. And I think something we've been focused on quite a bit on the commission. There's the discrete issue of income qualified and what particular programs are there to assist the most vulnerable. And then there's like affordability more at large for the entire customer base. And I didn't want this to go by without saying, I think one of our primary objectives, especially as I've seen it and, as we've been practicing, is trying to ensure that we're making the most affordable decisions at every turn anyway for the entire customer base at large, and ensuring that any expenditures that we're allowing to be made on customers' behalf and pass through to customers are absolutely necessary and represent the best value for those customers for the ends that we need to achieve. And so I didn't want to go without saying that there's kind of, this is a subpart of what goes on for affordability. So we have that much larger effort that I think we have been very focused on and will continue to be very focused on in every type of proceeding that comes before us. And to the extent we can keep the systems more affordable in total, decreases the number of customers needing this assistance. What we're talking about today is this narrower view of income qualified in particular. What do we do there to improve it? So I just wanted to there are two layers here that I see that we're constantly working at. Part of our goal is to minimize the number of customers who have to be in this area by continuing to do the hard work of basically analyzing every single thing that comes in the door to be sure we're being critical and minimizing those costs to the extent possible to maintain affordability across the board, and then using this where necessary for those folks who still need the help.
Amen. Every case, I feel like I ask for a rate impact model to see what we're doing on overall affordability, and as the capital investments ramp up, I couldn't agree more that we should be looking at overall affordability, not just focus on income qualified and disproportionately impacted communities. So appreciate you continuing to raise that. Ms. Crandall, you want to jump back in? I think that probably gives you more than you need on 2025 goals. Do you have any questions for us as you try and synthesize and bring this back, or do you want to jump on to the next section?
Yeah, thank you, commissioners. We've been kind of putting our heads together during the discussion. I don't think we have any questions at this time. We've certainly heard some, pros and cons to the different things that we put forward, and some leanings in terms of we need to start workshopping more of how we start looking at need and what kinds of approaches we might take to prioritizing funding in different ways. So as you all discussed, this is the kind of thing that could show up later in future proceedings as we keep working on what we've heard today. So.
And I guess if we were inclined to bring this back to a CWM in, say, early February or mid-February, would you have what you need to help us frame up that conversation?
I think so. I would probably defer maybe the discussion about timing and things like that to the end when we look at some of the procedural options, but I believe so. But if it's okay, let's keep going through some of the more objectives conversations and get the full. All right, well, thank you. So we wanted to go another level down in the discussion and look more at objectives for the 2025 work. And I think a lot of what you all have said really informs some of the potential objectives that we could bring forward. We are going to talk a little bit about the basis for some of the things that we think are potential priorities for work around income qualified bill assistance and energy programs for 2025. Again, this is for purposes of you all's discussion and thinking about prioritization and so forth. There are several sources for our STRA proposals, three main ones that we're going to talk about initially. You all have heard about the triennial PIP evaluation process based on a report that was filed. We'll talk briefly about that. I'll turn it over to my colleague, Ms. Anstey, to talk about the utility bill help program, and then I'll turn it over to my colleague, Ms. Moss, to talk a little bit about the Commission's ongoing disconnection and arrearage reporting. So we're going to provide a little bit of background here and then come back to, okay, this is what we think are some proposals for next steps work. The evaluation report, for anyone in the audience, there have been some prior information meetings on this, and so there's plenty more information available in the proceeding listed on this slide, as well as recordings from those meetings. We, in 2024, completed the second triennial evaluation. These are 3-year cycles where the Colorado Energy Office contracts with a third-party consultant and runs a process of evaluating the utility programs with partnership from entities like the Commission. The report was received in April of 2024, and you all had issued a decision seeking some general stakeholder comments on it. So some comments have come in about things that potentially really made sense to work on from the report, some follow-on questions stakeholders had, and so forth. Just a couple of the key takeaways and some things that came out of the report. The third-party consultant, GDS Associates, conducted data analysis, but they also did surveys of participants and non-participants and focus groups. Customers universally just about said that participation in these programs makes their bill easier to pay. So they make a significant difference to people's lives. That said, they were finding that the programs are likely only serving about 20% of potentially eligible Colorado electric and gas customers. Now, this is an approximate. We've had a number of numbers show up in the course of this discussion about potential eligibility, and you all have talked about the need to sort of winnow in on this. So just take numbers with a grain of salt. There were some estimates made for purposes of this report. The consultant also found that based on the data utilities had, the income for PIP participants in the most recent year was likely around $19,000 to $25,000 a year, but in practice it may be lower. And so that is closer to 100% federal poverty level. Then it's basically not reaching anywhere near the income eligibility caps that customers could enroll through the program. And then the surveys also indicated that PIP participants are more likely than non-program participants to have a household member with a disability or a durable medical device. So I think this is one of the values of this evaluation and survey process, is being able to dig in a little bit and understand customer populations and needs better. And out of that, the consultant made a number of recommendations here, just a couple that we're flagging. One is consider whether funding should be increased to enroll more potentially eligible customers. Another is the consultant noted that the utilities all have slightly different methodologies for doing things like tiering benefits or calculating how LEAP is factored in and so forth. And we might want to consider further standardizing these for fairness purposes. And also because a customer may be split and sometimes be served by one utility for one fuel and another utility for another fuel. And the consultant also recommended improvements to the overall evaluation process, including increased documentation on the utility side for program implementation, and more on the commission and energy office side for audit purpose and scope and so forth. And I will turn it over to Ms. Anstey for the next slide.
Thank you. Good afternoon, commissioners. And for all those who are also in the audience watching, there was a previous CIM done about the UBH program on October 25th. So if there's more information needed on that, go back and revisit. There were a lot of findings that came out from the utility bill help program and the implementation of the PIP program. And one of the largest things we found is that energy burden calculations create challenges in implementation. So customers who are income verified by LEAP, CEO, or EOC may have an energy burden that disqualifies them once they're referred to the utility. And this really comes back to that discussion about AMI and SMI and FPL, which I will get to in a second. Energy burden calculations also vary by utility, and customers who receive benefits from other programs like community solar garden subscriptions, they may be excluded from PIP programs. And on the face of it, we would say, well, if they're getting, community solar garden credits, then that means that their bill is affordable. But then we are not really building on giving a holistic view of benefits. We're saying, well, if you get this, then you don't get that. And I think we have to decide, if that's something we're looking, if we want benefits to build on one another, or say, you have a credit for solar community gardens, so you don't get it. And in practice, utilities are only calculating energy burden and enrolling customers in PIP based on federal poverty level rather than AMI or SMI. So earlier in the presentation, we were talking about how, you know, in our rules, we say it's 80% AMI can make you income qualified for the program, 60% SMI, or 200% FPL. And that does not align because 80% AMI is vastly different than 200% FPL. For example, 200% FPL for a family of 4 in Denver is $62,400, but 80% AMI is $89,400. So we're talking like a pretty large difference in cost. So we're saying, hey, you're income qualified at $89,000 per year, but once we get to looking at their energy burden, they're not eligible. Almost anybody who applies at 80% AMI is not going to be enrolled in a PIP program. So that energy burden flaw, it doesn't take into account those who are keeping houses at unhealthy temperatures because the energy burden is based on your income and your energy use. So if you are not making much, but you are keeping your house very cold or very hot, to prevent, you know, to save money or prevent arrearages or getting shut off, that doesn't really account for that. Those who spend more than 50% of their income on rent, which is not unheard of, or medical bills or other situations, energy burden does not take into account any of that. And it doesn't really address DIC communities and the burden that they also have. So energy burden was one of the big ones. Customers, another issue that we uncovered was that customers can get behind on their bills even while they're in a PIP program. And this really comes down to the fixed credit situation. What it does, if you are getting a fixed credit on PIP, you know, $50 a month or whatever, but there's a very hot month or a very cold month, then your bill might ultimately become unaffordable. So it is not unheard of to still get behind on your bills even while you're in the program. In practice, the utilities have a different approach to re-enrollment timelines, and these timelines are very heavily tied to LEAP. So some utilities follow everyone enrolls in November, or you can apply between November and April and get enrolled. And then all people who were enrolled in PIP will get unenrolled October 31st. And except for Excel, I believe, asked for a waiver to do that, to keep people in 12 months a year. So that's re-enrollment becomes a communication issue as well. How do we communicate to those who re-enroll or who enrolled through LEAP that even though you have to re-enroll through LEAP, you don't have to re-enroll through PIP? It gets very messy. Another point was that while utilities do they've increased that data-driven outreach like we were discussing for disconnections, there really is a limited proactive enrollment. Many of the people we see applying even through utility bill help are already receiving disconnection notices. So we haven't caught anybody on the upfront. And as I mentioned before, applicants are unclear about enrollment in PIP, including the lack of knowledge of even being referred to PIP. If you enroll through LEAP, you don't even know you're being referred. If you enroll through EOC, sometimes you know you are. Through UBH, that's all we are doing. But it's, if you do get enrolled in PIP, you get a letter. But if you don't, you never find out. And this year, UBH has changed that. But and then lastly, in practice, utilities have different approaches to disconnection protections and communication. And this is really talking about, like, you could be applying to get assistance through UBH, and it takes about 60 days, and you could be disconnected in that process. And lastly, I just want to say that those who get behind on payments while they are in the PIP program can be dropped from the program and ultimately disconnected. Because if you get behind on your bill and you don't pay it, you can be dropped out, which is only furthering the cycle of getting into arrearages. Any questions before I move on to the next slide?
Commissioner Plant, I don't have any questions. Commissioner Plant, Commissioner Goman.
I just had a quick question. And I know that you're kind of planning on pulling together all the various different ways in which these programs line up and don't line up. But the idea of people being rejected right at the beginning of heating season just seems bonkers to me. And I feel like we have to have a better solution for that. And then I was just wondering if do any states use sort of a categorical eligibility? When determining eligibility, just if you qualify for all these various different things, then you're automatically in.
Yeah, we actually met with Massachusetts. They're one state where it's they do it in a different way where the utilities will send over to Massachusetts version of CDHS or Human Services. They'll say, these are all our customers. And then CDHS, they have a main database that says these people are in SNAP, or there are certain programs that are categorically used, and they automatically enroll them. And so those customers just automatically get enrolled. I don't believe Massachusetts is the only state, but that was one that we got a little more familiar with. It does require a lot larger of an OIT lift.
Well, I mean, I know that, we do have, a fairly good OIT system that's in place for that. I don't know what it takes to add that capability, but, and, certainly that would need to come, through, the governor's office of legislature. But this is I think that clearly housing affordability has been a key focus of the administration and the legislature, and this is an important component of that. So there may be support there.
Yeah, and Ms. Anstey can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I mean, to the extent categorical eligibility means you're eligible for one program and therefore you can use that as a proxy to get into another. I think we have a lot of examples in Colorado of parts of that. What we don't have is a full, every program cross-reference to each other, I think, to a certain extent. Just kind of clarifying, I think, we'll talk a little bit about Senate Bill 207 in a bit. I would say that's a bit of a categorical eligibility bill because it tries to list out a number of different things that you can use as proxies for enrollment. But so I think that's just the gap, is we have some, we don't have everything in place.
Yes, and UVH does categorical eligibility. Since we cannot do IQ, looking at people's actual incomes. So anybody who's in SNAP or Medicaid, that kind of thing, can we automatically refer them then. Okay, next slide. So this just kind of shows what kind of factors are affecting the eligibility for PIP programs. Obviously, across the board, energy usage, and that comes back to that energy burden. Everyone is using energy usage in their calculations. Another thing that is complicating is that everybody except Excel is applying LEAP credits to the PIP credit. And what that means is that LEAP credits are put towards arrearages first, but then if there are no arrearages, they take that LEAP credit, calculate your unaffordable portion, and take the LEAP credit and put it towards the affordable portion. So, meaning you could not get PIP credits because you have LEAP. And I think that's something that probably needs to be looked at, how that's applied, and keeping it standardized across the board for fairness and equity across. So that's one thing. Solar credits, I talked a little bit about that before, just how you could end up with credits on your account, enough credits that you wouldn't actually have a bill, so then you wouldn't get PIP. Excessive arrearages is one thing. In most cases, in most utilities, arrearages are forgiven the first time you enter into a program. Excel is doing, I believe every utility except Black Hills does that. So for the first time customer, but it would be easier if we standardized how this went so that we could communicate across all IOUs and customers about when you have an arrearage the first time you're enrolled, it could be forgiven, but moving on from that, what you would need to do to address arrearages. Continued credits on account kind of goes back to the solar credits, or even a continued, say, LEAP credit, or even a continued PIP credit. If you are energy efficient, but we're accepted into PIP, and then you continue to carry that PIP credit, you at some point could be unenrolled from PIP. Most vulnerable served, we are always trying to serve the most vulnerable. Black Hills does have a wait list, and so they look at the most vulnerable being the ones with the highest energy burden and the lowest income to prioritize their wait list. And as mentioned before, applicants typically are unenrolled on October 31st of every year. Some are not aware of that and then don't know that they're losing their benefit. For those, again, who apply through LEAP, that's not a problem because they're continuing to apply. But for everybody else, that does cause some situations. I think that's really all I have. I will say with LEAP or other benefits that are taken into account when we're calculating that affordable amount, that's 6%, what we're not doing is complementing the PIP benefit. We're rather saying it's all siloed. Like if you get LEAP benefits, maybe you don't get PIP, whereas the two could potentially be more complementary to one another to give you a customer a holistic bill that would ideally prevent them from getting into arrearages again and going through that cycle. Any questions? I'm going to hand it over to Tamar if there aren't any questions.
Okay, good afternoon, commissioners. We have been tracking disconnections and arrearage metrics that we receive through monthly reports from the utilities, and I have a few figures to share with you today. So these figures show the average arrearage dollars for each vintage, which is a set of days for each of the 4 utilities. And of note on this slide is that all of the y-axes are different for each utility. So you'll see that some of them are much larger than others. And also of note is that because Atmos gives bill credits at the beginning of the year, they have a negative arrearage balance at the onset. What's apparent here is the seasonality of the arrearages. So you may notice that arrearages tend to increase at the end of the LEAP enrollment cycle and then throughout the heating season. Another thing about this is that a customer may be in arrears for a long period of time if they pay off a small part of their bill monthly, and that's why we have these larger vintages. Next slide, please. These figures show the total customers that are in arrears and the total arrearage dollars across all arrearage vintages and across all utilities for 2019 through 2022. We don't show arrearage trends past 2022 because we received this data from a one-time report. As you can see here, the arrearages tend to increase in the late summer for cooling and continue to increase through the winter as it gets colder. Of note is that the number of customers in arrears has maintained relatively constant across the years, but the arrearage dollars have increased year after year, which could be an indication that the way assistance programs like PIP are designed is not protecting customers from rate increases. Next slide, please. These figures show the monthly disconnections and reconnections by utility for 2023 through 2024. As the chair showed in his slide, you can see that many but not all disconnections are reconnected. And again, the axes on these 4 figures are all very different. You can also see that all of the utilities follow a similar trend in disconnections and reconnections, though in August of 2024, Excel's disconnections skyrocketed. We find that there are a few disconnections during the winter due to temperature-based moratorium on disconnections, and disconnections then tend to increase in the spring once the low temperature rule has been lifted and arrearages have accumulated throughout the heating season. Next slide, please. And lastly, here are figures that show the total disconnections by utility and by fuel respectively. As the largest utility, you'll notice that most disconnections come from Excel. And also of interest is that most disconnections are from electric or for electric disconnections. And you can see here the very apparent spike that we saw in this past August. While we're not entirely sure what caused the spike, we have a few ideas. Some of it has to do with the weather restrictions that I just mentioned, and also the LEAP assistance that a customer receives goes towards their gas and not towards their electric bill. And so while they receive a upfront LEAP credit for their gas, as the cooling season continues, they accrue more arrears in electric for their electric bills. So we're continuing to collect these metrics monthly and are hoping to track them to better gauge affordability. And I will pass it back to Kelly.
Thank you, Ms. Moss. Nice job.
Well, thank you, Commissioner. So what we've been doing is to kind of come up with a little bit more clarity around some next steps for work is taking all the information that you've just heard. So the PIP evaluation, comments that stakeholders provided on it, lessons learned from the UBH program, material from disconnection reports, and we've been starting to group next steps of into certain categories, some being more policy related. Is the program doing what it needs to do? Are there maybe legislative things that relate to the program design? Some are more implementation issues, like are the rules and the administrative practices with the program supporting or impeding its overall goals? We've been looking at the commission's administrative side. So like what do the commission and its staff need to monitor and evaluate programs? And then things like communications and education and what can be done to improve the customer experience without actually looking at any rules changes. There are 2 other drivers I just wanted to flag that we have in mind as we're thinking these through. One is the implementation of Senate Bill 21-272, which, as you all know, we'll be working on bringing forward a proposed set of rules associated with implementing this, ideally this quarter. And in the capstone report that was filed summarizing the outcomes of stakeholder engagement in the pre-rulemaking, we talked about the prospect of some kind of energy equity plan that could be created by utilities as sort of a central repository to talk about which communities are disproportionately impacted, what is the size and scope of the income qualified population within the utility service area, and be looking more robustly at how programs are packaged and performing together to look at from the perspective of effectiveness and equity. We also have some new legislation that the Commission is in the course of implementing. It's Senate Bill 24-207 from last year, creates the concept of inclusive community solar gardens, which would be implemented beginning in 2026. And it sets more requirements for subscription coordinators to enroll income qualified customers using a variety of approaches. So kind of back to that concept of categorical eligibility, it lists a lot of different approaches that can be used as proxies for verifying a customer's individual income to participate in the program. It also allows self-attestation. And the legislation also requires the commission to consider how to coordinate community solar garden subscriptions with other types of programs. And we think that really suggests the need to do some of the things you all are talking about in mapping together programs and figuring out where they are best combined and what the barriers are to combining them. So I will briefly share the 3 categories of work that we propose for 2025. Again, this is straw proposals for you all's discussion. I think some of the things that you will see here reflect some things that we've been talking about. I think not all of it is going to reflect all of the things that have been discussed throughout this conversation. So looking forward to getting your thoughts on this. But the 3 categories are about enhancing the existing bill assistance program, looking at longer term and structural changes for that assistance program, and then improving income qualified bill assistance and program integration. So the first category is where we're thinking about standardizing efforts to standardize the PIT program across utilities and make sure that we have we are fully understanding all practices that determine not just if a customer is eligible, but they're actually enrolled in the program. And seeing what barriers can be removed or where things can be qualified, made more available to the customers for knowledge purposes and that sort of thing. So the 5 areas we're talking about are clarifying arrearage practices across utilities. We have some utilities that forgive arrears upfront, others that forgive it over time. And so it can create inconsistencies depending on which utilities the customer is working with. Second proposal for work is to, for each utility, identify each of the administrative practices that relate to actual program enrollment and see what can be standardized and clarified. Third is to clarify and potentially standardize how all the utilities are calculating fixed credits for customers because there are some variations. Again, we're not sure if standardization is fully needed or appropriate, but this is a situation where we want to explore that. Ensure that there are clear and consistent standards for preventing disconnection while the customer is applying for assistance. Ms. Anstey mentioned that there are variations in how this is treated in terms of protecting the customer during the application process, since it can take some time to go through. We'd like to make sure we clearly understand that, can clearly communicate it to customers, and see if it can be standardized where it's not. And then talk about improving customer communications more broadly in some of the areas that she was mentioning, things like lack of clear information about the re-enrollment process, depending on the pathway the commission or the customer used to enroll, for example. The second category is what I would consider the bigger structural changes. Some may, in fact, relate to thinking about whether legislative direction is beneficial. So 5 areas we talked about is we now have these other enrollment pathways for the PIT program. Some are more commonly used than others. So we're working on tracking more data to figure out how customers are enrolled and where there are duplicates to see if maybe some of these enrollment pathways should be amplified, some should go away, that sort of thing. There's been some discussion about the challenges with the fixed credit approach for PIT programs. I think it has pros and cons, certainly, but we could explore transitioning from fixed credit to fixed payment. Fixed payment would be something like 3% of a customer's income as the max that they would pay for a utility bill. States have different approaches to this sort of thing that could be explored. Third thing we have is we've mentioned some of the challenges with the use of the energy burden criteria as a secondary step after income. It may make sense to think about some alternatives for that, including modifying, changing the threshold of energy burden, or even eliminating that as a requirement at certain income levels. So that's one of the things that we've thought about that would have the effect of, for example, anybody 200% federal poverty line would be eligible for the program, even if their energy burden was low, for example. Fourth area is calculate potentially eligible customers and levels of funding needed depending on participation. I think I heard a lot of you all's interest in working this out better, thinking about, if we define eligibility this way, here's the assistance needed. If we define eligibility that way, here's the assistance needed. And then I think considering changes to the PIP triennial evaluation process, we already got some great comments on how that process could be streamlined. We may want to think of even bigger changes to that depending on what other kinds of structural changes the commission might be interested in looking at, which could influence future rules. And then the final category before I turn it back over to you is we're thinking a third category of work would be on improving program integration. And so there are some examples where so Xcel Energy filed in an electric rate case that's been mentioned, a comprehensive list of income qualified programs and their eligibility criteria. We think that's the kind of thing that we could build on, map that with other utilities, be getting budget information, understanding program coordinators, and be really looking at whether these programs are intended to serve similar customer bases or what the barriers would be to combining and coordinating them. Certainly would love to hear more from you all on your thoughts around that topic. And then the other thing that we're talking about is we currently have a number of different reports. We discuss the monthly disconnection reports. We have a few other reports on PIP programs, disconnections, assistance, and so forth. We'd like to think about how we could consolidate those reports and get them into a single source so that they can be analyzed more robustly. And hopefully we could also reduce some of the volume of reporting attached to that while we're doing that. So with that, I will turn it back over to you. Please let me know if you have any questions on any of the things we proposed, but happy to let you all discuss.
Greatly appreciated, Ms. Crandall, and with the understanding that we're going to also consider the items we discussed earlier about targeting the most at-risk customers, etc. I strongly support this work agenda, but curious to hear what my colleagues think. Commissioner Plant, comments, questions?
Yeah, thanks. I agree. I support that agenda. Particularly a couple of the items that you had there. One, we've talked about sort of this trying to consolidate and sort of unify the process. I think not only would it make it easier for us to evaluate, but it would make it a lot easier for customers to participate if it weren't so disjointed in many ways with various different qualifying processes and different ways in which different numbers are calculated, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, depending on what utility you happen to be in. And the other thing I will say I was surprised in the PIP report to find out was that it's a credit program and not a percentage payment. I mean, one of the P's is payment, right? So I was really surprised to find that out. I can see how that led to some pretty significant issues during the 22 heating season. And I feel like that maybe exacerbated our problems at that time rather than helping to solve them. So I'm really interested in getting more information around our alternatives on that. And the other thing that I'd love for and this may go into more of the M docket process. But as you're, looking through and evaluating these various different things, seeing where there might be opportunities for legislation to make some of these issues a little easier to deal with, and where we can identify where there are obstacles that might be able to be addressed in order to make the process a little bit smoother, I think would be really helpful.
Appreciate it, Commissioner Plant. Commissioner Gumman.
Yeah, and thank you, Mr. Crandall, for really well thought out presentation of these ideas. I think right along the lines of what Commissioner Plant was talking about, having kind of as an angle, a little more clarity on what is already within our abilities, like what can we adjust, whether by practice or suggestion or by rule changes for the utility delivered programs. And then for these third-party programs or programs kind of outside of our control, what, if any, kind of influence do we have if we see ways to help streamline or optimize kind of participation and customer experience and simplicity? I think just understanding a little better, like what is within our abilities. Commissioner Plant talked about legislation. I don't have a clear view on like in what areas would legislation be required versus just a rule change or something we already can do on our own. So like kind of keeping that lens to help focus us on, I guess, the barriers or access that we have to each of these potential changes. With regard to the fixed credit versus fixed payment, yeah, I generally agree where I can see that becomes a problem, especially if you have, say, gas commodity price spikes and things like that. I have like a little bit of anxiety about fixed payment in terms of ensuring that we are also instilling kind of a motivation to save energy where possible and not kind of be ambivalent as to the usage. So I would just love to, I don't know that I'm prepared to say I definitively think it's better to go to fixed payment. I certainly can see like the real challenges with the fixed credit, but probably what I'd like to learn here is, what can we learn from other states, from how this is done elsewhere? I'd hate to see kind of movement there and then significantly higher usage or something like that, because folks are not kind of responsible for any of that increase in the usage. So I just want to kind of understand all the sides of that, coming from a lot of energy efficiency background. It makes me nervous when we take away anyone's kind of relationship to their total usage, and seeing that and understanding, how that affects that would be very helpful to understand if that definitively is a better way to go before we go forward and say that definitely would be better. So I guess those are my thoughts on that list at this point.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add. I just echo trying to clarify what's under our control and what's not. And I just make clear that at this stage of the game, we're asking questions, trying to understand best practice nationally, and the three of us in the commission isn't endorsing any one change or approach. We're like I said, just trying to get at national best practice and trying to figure out what works best here. So with that, Ms. Crandall, does that give you what you need on this section?
Thank you, commissioners. I think I just have one follow-up, and it's just to sort of talk about the connection between the goals and the objectives a little bit. So, one of the proposals that has come up is how long should enrollment last? Given that we now have these multiple different funnels, some income qualify annually, some income qualify on much longer timeframes. And so, we could look at that. We could look at a question like that from the goal of, does this increase the ease of customers getting into and staying into programs? We could also look at it from the angle of, what does that do to the ability to increase enrollment and things like that? How does that affect the budget? So just sort of, I don't know if you all had any thoughts on that, but just kind of wanted to make that connection. Because I think we are going to have a lot of nuances to deal with as we start getting into these questions of, well, how would we reform a program in a particular way?
I don't have any real guidance on that. I don't know, Commissioner Plant, anything you'd like to add?
No, I think, as the chair pointed out, at this point, just gathering information, identifying best practices, opportunities, and, gaps and barriers, I think are the things that it would be good to focus on. And then we can kind of take all that, synthesize it, and figure out what the best ways to address it are, what's within our power, or where we need help from other entities.
Commissioner Goman, anything you'd add?
No, I generally agree with those comments.
All right, Ms. Crandall.
Well, this takes us to the final discussion, which is talking a little bit about the proposed processes and next steps. So what I'm going to do is raise a couple of ideas for some next steps, because I don't think this is this is a single thing and it moves forward as, the next step is another CIM to talk about it. I think this kind of filters into a few different activities. With the caveat that, we are going to be taking back what you all have talked about and kind of thinking about this, and, things may look different from what I've initially put forward when they actually come to weekly meetings for discussion. But we are proposing, there may be 3 procedural actions that make sense as follow-ups here. The first is to talk about a very focused miscellaneous proceeding for this coming year that would take on some of the questions that have been discussed here. The second one would be looking at delaying the next PIP triennial evaluation, and the third would be looking at some possible modifications to disconnection reporting. So the first thing that we have been starting to think about is creating a very targeted and time-limited miscellaneous proceeding. So basically be, wrapping work that's been done with the PIP evaluation this year and taking it into a very focused process that would be limited to only 2025 to try and accomplish certain things. And so we've been thinking about, this might be the kind of thing that could be developed as a stakeholder process, where we're taking lessons from what we did with the staff capstone report in the 272 context. And we're assigning, a mix of PUC staff and other volunteers to run tracks of work to answer particular questions and file reports in response to what the commission's been looking for. And so we could use that to basically, rather than moving straight into a rulemaking, continue refining all of these things that we've talked about to figure out what would actually be the proposed rules changes. Consider maybe where there's statutory clarification needed, and just keep going on the process of making measurable improvements to existing programs that are in line with the goals that you all have talked about. So again, this is sort of, at a high level, I think the tracks of work we've been sort of thinking about are similar to some of the things that you're talking about. I think we were going to need to take some of this back and make sure that we've built in all the right pieces, but we're thinking there's maybe a track of work that would create more of a standard for quantifying income qualified populations across utilities and looking at some of these nuances that you all have talked about so that we can better understand, what are potentially eligible populations. I think that would go a long way toward assessing budget impacts and rate impacts. We're looking at a second track that would be really digging into the PIP and looking at both, what are the near-term things that can be done without rules changes to keep making continuous improvement each heating season. but then also starting to evaluate some of the longer term, more structural or bigger programmatic changes. We're thinking about a third track of work that would be on this program coordination question and really increasing the mapping of how all the programs fit together and how they could fit together. And then the fourth would be taking all the things that we've learned from that and streamlining reporting requirements. And I think that's something that would really need to be tied into the equity work. And if the commission, if we as staff propose an energy equity plan, and that is something that the commission moves forward and propose rules around 272, I think it would be really beneficial to coordinate those efforts where possible. So that's the first.
Ms. Crandall, before we jump into
Sure.
the delaying the triennial PIP evaluation, would it be useful to talk about the M docket, or do you want to just get through all three of the recommendations and then come back and have a broader discussion?
I think I can go through the other two super quick, and then I can just pass to you all. If that's okay.
Yep.
So the next proposal is because some of the changes we're talking about could involve rules changes, and rulemakings can be pretty extensive timing wise. We're thinking it might make sense to see if participants in the process so far could agree to an appropriate timeline, even initially, to delay the next PIP triennial evaluation. Again, this is managed by the Colorado Energy Office, but technically under the rules, the work would be starting again in late 2025. We're not even sure that we would have a rulemaking started around PIP changes by then. And we have seen problems when we have rules changes in the middle of an evaluation. So, another thing that we could bring back to you all is a potential decision to get a consensus filing around how long would be appropriate to delay that and whether some other steps need to be taken to delay that effort. And then we are also, I want to give Ms. Moss particular credit for this. She has been doing a ton of work to map all of our metrics that are being collected around disconnections, arrearages, and assistance programs, and get more of a comparison together so that we can hopefully simplify that in the future. She's also working with Ms. Anstey on building a dashboard that will be made public on program enrollment and some other key metrics. However, I think it's going to take a while, as if you all do want to move forward, for example, with more of an M-docket process. I think we would probably be doing a lot of work that could change what reporting is useful in the future. So we may, in the near term, want to consider bringing forward a decision, or just if there's a filing about simplifying some of the disconnection reporting in the meantime. Because I think there are a couple of things, particularly like forecasting, which we don't necessarily need to continue working on right now. I think we might want to build that out through a different process. So anyway, those are the three things that we've been thinking about procedurally, and happy to turn it over to you all for any questions or discussion.
Thank you again, Ms. Crandall. And for me, at least, I'm supportive of delaying the next PIP evaluation, as you suggest. Also supportive of an effort to refine the near-term reporting. And like you, just want to highlight the progress and work that's been done over the last year, which is a substantial improvement in the reporting. So again, thanks to you and the team and Ms. Moss for that. On the M docket, I think I'm supportive of all four tracks you outlined, but would just add on a couple things. One, it'd be nice to have a sort of a focused discussion at a CWM about your prior slide on sort of big picture goals for 2025, and see if, as a commission and an agency, we can't get a 1 or 2 page document that sort of summarizes that and structures these tracks of work, or helps structure these tracks of work. And I might also suggest maybe a track 5 and a track 6. Track 5 might be exploring ways to more specifically target help towards the most at-risk customers, sort of as said, with all of Commissioner Gilman's caveats about how it's categorized and defined. But sort of shifting away, or in addition to what we do with all income qualified customers, exploring how we more proactively, whether it's through disconnect or other mechanisms, help the most at-risk customers. And then there might be a track 6, which for me goes back to Commissioner Plant's comments on performance metrics, Commissioner Gilman's comments on more general affordability, and just looks at the big picture about everything we're doing, not just the bill assistance, but also the clean energy programs, and gets sort of a consistent set of data and understanding. So we're not doing this ad hoc on the fly in every individual case. But it's, there's an M-docket record that can be used in every going forward case, with updated information that shows the total dollars, the eligible customers, with an understanding of disconnect and arrearages, and, based on a, sort of an overall sense of where the commission's trying to get to. So, I don't know, Commissioner Plant, anywhere you'd like to go on the tracks 5, 6, overall objectives, delaying the triennial report, or disconnect data and reporting?
Yeah, no, I agree with all of those things. Yeah, I think getting some consistent measurement would be really helpful. The thing I wanted to ask about, Ms. Crandall, is just if as we be going through this MDoc with these various different tracks, if there would be the ability for the public, institutions, stakeholders, or specific interveners also to contribute to sort of building up a record of suggestions, ideas, models, things that they've encountered in other states that have worked, or other places, just so that we can have, within each track, maybe repositories of sort of some of the best thinking from around the community, so that we could, incorporate that into our discussions and considerations.
Yeah, I mean, I think a nice thing about a miscellaneous docket is it can be a bit choose your own adventure in creating what areas it would focus on. I do think we should, what we are going to be doing based on this discussion is taking the straw proposal and what you all have talked about, and looking at it through sort of the lens of resources and other cases and things like that, and trying to come up with, what's a good next step. And we can work with you all on how you would like that structured as we get closer to an actual decision point at a weekly meeting on bringing something forward. But yeah, there's absolutely a lot of opportunities to be creative in, how the stakeholder engagement looks and what kind of information is collected and so forth. We will want to lay that out when we get into, we'll probably want to lay out a work plan attached to this with opening a proceeding, should you all decide to do that.
Great, thanks.
Commissioner Gilman, anywhere you'd like to go?
The question for you, Ms. Crandall, is we identify kind of the need to get more information about certain things. I mean, probably most specifically like multifamily situations and how that influences what we know and don't know, especially among some of the most vulnerable customers, as well as the propensity to pay, idea like what's out there, what's actually being used, what's it being used for, how are disconnections prioritized. Do you see that sort of being done in track one, or would that be something, if that's a somewhat of a priority for 2025, is that done in one of the tracks you laid out? Is that like peripheral? Would it be done in the M docket? I just wanted to kind of understand how we might structure that work.
I don't necessarily have an answer to that right now. I
Okay.
think in some of the original proposals you had seen, I was looking at, trying to stage deliverables if we do kind of a stakeholder-led process with reports so that things are building on each other. I think I'm really going to need to take this back though and respond in the future with more specifics on that question.
Yeah, that's fine. I just want to make sure, I mean, to the extent that some of that information could inform what we see as the next steps or what we see as feasible, I didn't want it to get lost in our discussion of the tracks. Like, as we think it through going from today, we might want to think about the phasing of like, what do we expect to figure out and what does that feed into, just to make sure, if that ends up being consumed by track one, that's fine. But like, just wanted to not kind of lose sight of that. And then, despite me just adding those things, I just want to say, I certainly want to acknowledge we need to be cognizant of the workload here in terms of, we don't have necessarily dedicated staff that are intended to fill this role. Ms. Crandall's a commission advisor who works on plenty of other very large proceedings before us. And so I think we're going to have to be pretty strategic about what are the absolute most important things to get done and in what order, and be pretty realistic about the time frame that it will take to do that, essentially without a dedicated resource for these purposes. So just wanted to acknowledge that, Ms. Crandall, and certainly appreciate all the work you've done thus far, but I understand this is not your only responsibility, and we'll all have to ideally once you kind of digest today and come back to us. I just wanted to acknowledge, I think we understand that this is not your only job here at the commission, and understand that there will be some pressures on your schedule and the others trying to get these things done.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Commissioner. I think, and I do want to just acknowledge there are a lot of staff at the agency who work on this from different angles. We're the ones presenting before you who have been most involved in this part of the process. But I think for next steps, one of the reasons we wanted to talk about this at an information meeting is because it does touch on so many potential upcoming processes for the next year. So we'll want to look not only at resources, but also, we have a very regular heating season cycle. So what aspects of this should be done before the next heating season to provide enough time for implementation? We have proposed rules around disproportionately impacted communities to be working on. What portions of that might relate to some of the programmatic questions about what kinds of programs get combined. So that I think there's a lot of puzzle pieces we'll want to work on as we're coming up with taking this information, converting it into the next steps. But it some of the things that you all have talked about may not even be in the course of an M docket a hypothetical M docket we've been discussing. It may show up in even other places.
Well, and I hope you do get a dedicated resource, Ms. Crandall. And I think to the extent you can prioritize issues as part of the 2025 goal setting, that'd be great. So does that give you what you need on next step and procedures?
May I take just a moment to confer with a couple of my colleagues and just make sure?
Yeah, should we just take a 5-minute break till like 3:10 and come back at 3:10, or do you need a little more time?
I actually think I just need a minute here. If I could just go quiet for a second.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. I think that we have what we need. And I mean, you know, as we've said several times, this is not a decision. There will be, you know, proposals coming forward to you all at weekly meetings, so there will be more opportunities to discuss the details and just make sure they're aligning with what you all have been talking about here.
Sounds good. So I guess just one last thing on timing before we wrap up. Or are you still thinking in early to mid-February, maybe bring back to a weekly meeting? And if it takes longer, obviously it takes longer, but just to set expectations while all three of us are here, is that sort of roughly consistent with your thinking?
Yes, I would say I've been benchmarking 30 to 45 days after this meeting as when follow-up actions would start. I will be honest that I'm not, it is very much going to depend on some other scheduling things, but I think certain things like PIP, you know, exploring next steps around the PIP triennial evaluation, I think could happen very quickly. So I think that that is feasible mid to late next month.
Sounds good. Well, again, I just want to thank you and the team for the leadership and driving these issues forward, and greatly appreciate all the work and effort that went into today's presentation and trying to structure the agenda and workflow for 2025. So with that, Commissioner Plant, any concluding thoughts?
Yeah, just echo that and thank you for all your work on this and everybody's work on the team. This is, you know, it's obviously an important issue and one that matters to thousands of Coloradans. And you know, it really, as you keep on peeling back the layers of the onion, seeing how complicated and complex it is, and helping us to figure out if there's any way that we can make it simpler and help out folks. So appreciate all your work on this.
Hopefully peeling back the onion won't bring on too many tears, Commissioner Plant. Commissioner Gilman. Too late. Too late. Commissioner Gilman.
Yeah, really appreciate the organization and the suggestions here, Ms. Crandall, to keep us moving forward on this, and appreciate you as well as the rest of the team. It can be hard to tackle some of these much larger kind of overriding issues, especially when we have kind of the pressive business with regular filings and there are deadlines and hearings and things that come up. But I appreciate you really keeping us moving forward on really a very important subject matter, but so broad that it can be difficult sometimes to get focused and figure out what to do next. And really appreciate your efforts to get us there and move us forward for a plan for 2025.
Ms. Crandall, any final thoughts before we adjourn? Questions?
That's it for me. Thank you, commissioners. We've appreciated the discussion with you.
Likewise, thanks all. With that, we'll adjourn and see everybody tomorrow. Thanks.